Thank you everyone who joined us today. I'm Irina Skubi, the coordinator of Eurasian and Eastern European Studies Network at the Department of History at Queen's University. This network was established in 2018 with the aim to expand the understanding of Eastern Europe and serve as a platform for collaboration between the scholars in this field. And this virtual symposium is organized jointly with the Global History Initiative at the Department of History. And first of all, I would like to start with land acknowledgement and say that I'm joining today from the traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory, where Queen's University is situated. And we are grateful to be able to learn and live on these lands. And I'm also very grateful to many people at this department, Russian Eastern European Studies and Global History Initiative, for supporting the idea of this symposium from the very beginning and for being instrumental in its organization, and particularly Professor Rebecca Manley, Amitava Chowdhury, Sven Steinberg, Professor Shusha Shergov from the Department of Political Sciences, and the News and Social Media Assistant of the Department of History, Russell Arbig. The Department of History provided us with a general support from the Nugent Fund to organize this event, and we are very grateful for this. Earlier this year, in March 2023, we already held a symposium devoted to Ukrainian studies in times of survival, with a great panel of speakers, Tanya Richardson, Maria Mayerchik, Andriy Zayernyuk, and today we are very welcome and ready to host another event with another fabulous panel of speakers. As Russia's war against Ukraine is still ongoing, we still keep a focus on Ukrainian studies at the center of our attention. And while acknowledging the importance of the place in decolonization in the local context, we also would like to move beyond the Eastern European studies and other area studies of this region. And we are grateful to host today these experts to talk about the experiences of decolonizing practices from their respective fields, such as Ukrainian studies, Soviet studies, Central Asian studies, German, Northern and Latin American, and African studies as well. And as you can see from the poster of this event, highlighting the Kharkiv metro station in Eastern Ukraine, we also would like to think about non-academic areas of decolonization and move beyond academic discourses and think about the ongoing decolonizing efforts in the public spaces and seek for comparative examples from the global south and the underrepresented regions. It is important also to acknowledge that we are meeting today exactly at the day of anniversary of the October Revolution of 1917, and the aim of this symposium is to bring us more understanding about the legacies of this event and to our respective countries, to the region and to the global context. And now I'm very glad to present my co-moderator and co-organizer of this event, Professor Amitava Chowdhury, an associate professor and chair of the Department of History and director of Global History Initiative. Professor Chowdhury is a historian and historical archaeologist of agrarian labor regimes and colonial plantations in the British, Caribbean and the Indian Ocean, and is interested in the meaning in the theory of global history and diaspora studies. He is particularly focused on issues of identity, nationalism, and diaspora formations of the Indian overseas. Previously, Dr. Chowdhury worked on the historical archaeological excavations of colonial Mauritius, and two of his excavated sites were subsequently inscribed as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. He is also a former fellow at the Weatherhead Initiative in Global History at the Weatherhead Center of International Affairs at Harvard University. Professor Chowdhury, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Irina. Thank you, first of all, for organizing this event. And thanks to all the participants and the panelists who have arrived at this virtual venue for us to discuss decolonization. I want to talk about our department a little bit. The research, we in the Department of History run a number of research initiatives, and REES and the Global History Initiative, GHI, are two of them. And we sort of started at the same time. I think the Global History Initiative was launched in 2017. But this is the first event where we are jointly organizing an event together. I don't think REES and GHI have co-hosted any event in the past. So that's a wonderful, I think, initiative, and going forward, we might think about other ways of bringing Eastern European studies with the Global History Initiative at Queen's. And I'm much of an interloper here. I'm not a historiopenist, as you heard from Irina's introduction. My interest is more about the intellectual aspects of what we might call the decolonizing program in academia, and the globalizing initiatives as well, and how we can perhaps bring global history in conversation with the decolonizing project. I prefer to use the term decolonizing over decolonization, just to signify action instead of accomplishment, but also perhaps to separate the academic project from the political one. But my interest in decolonizing academia is firmly grounded in the project of global history. And I therefore wanted to speak very briefly on the intersection between global history and the decolonizing program, and what it might mean for us today as we engage in this afternoon's conversation. So what is the essence of global history that we can bring into this discussion? And I think the core thought here is the idea that thought is related to place, and intellectual ideas, categories of knowledge, structures of knowledge, social structures, they originate in a particular place. However, they, or many of those, have gone through a universalizing process, which have given them the persona of a universal process. So for example, we can talk about the idea of class as a social structure, as a concept. That has a very particular historical background in European history, West European history, that we seem to think applies everywhere else today. People do talk about class in every other continent. That kind of a universal application of a particular thought is what global history tries to critique. So the job of global history then is to bring out the local histories of these universalizing global processes. The job, therefore, is to somehow rescue history from the nation, therefore. And you would know that history as an academic discipline was born precisely at the same time that the nation state was born, and that also in Western Europe. So being bound up in the same process, the endeavor to rescue history from the nation lies at the center of global history. So from a post-colonial vantage, central to the project of decolonizing academia is the reflection that Western discourse is indispensable, but at the same time, it is inadequate. And this is in Chakraborty's phrasing. That, to me, is the very essence of what we may call decolonizing academia. So hence the process of globalizing academia, or the curriculum, and the process of decolonizing academia are interrelated and often one and the same. So this is the position from which I approach the idea of decolonizing, and hopefully some of your responses and discussions this afternoon can help us further understand the project. I will resist the thought that decolonizing academia is a process of rewriting the syllabi, for example, or removing European concepts from our discussions, because that's a harmful exercise. You know, European history can equally engage and benefit from the emancipatory dimensions of globalizing and decolonizing process, just as any other history can. And that is central to the understanding that it is not about geography that we are talking about. We are talking about knowledge structures more than anything else. I think we will discuss this point later, but my understanding is that you do not have to have gone through a process of colonialism to be able to engage in the process of decolonizing the curriculum. So that's the intellectual impetus for my involvement and invitation, I would think, to this symposium. With that, let me welcome our panelists today and introduce you to our audience, and I will afterwards then hand over to Irina for the discussion. So the panelists, I'll start alphabetically, start with Oksana Dudko. Oksana is a historian of 20th century Europe with a special focus on violence, gender, and the cultural history of Ukraine, Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union. And currently, Oksana is a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. She received her previous PhD in history from Ivan Franko National University in Ukraine. Oksana has taught the history of Ukraine, Soviet Union, gender and violence, mass killing, and genocide at the University of Saskatchewan, York University, Ivan Franko National University, and Ukrainian Catholic University. In addition, Oksana, for more than 15 years, has been curating theater and exhibition projects in Europe. She's a founding director and artistic curator of international theater and the drama festivals Drabina and Drama in Ukraine. Oksana's most recent publication is Gate Crashing European and Slavic Area Studies, Can Ukrainian Studies Transform the Fields, published in the Canadian Slavonic Papers this year. Our second participant, alphabetically speaking, is Manuel Ferez-Gil. Manuel is a PhD candidate in sociology at the Alberto Hurtado University in Santiago de Chile. He has a master's degree in European integration from the Autonomous University of Barcelona and specialized studies in ethnic and religious minorities in the Middle East and Caucasus. His prior degree in sociology from National Autonomous University of Mexico. Manuel has compiled 6 academic works, among which Ukraine's Many Faces, published in 2023 from Transcript Verlag, and Discovering Ukraine, Its People, Its History, and Its Culture, also published this year from Universidad San Isidro, Argentina. In recent years, Manuel has focused on promoting Latin American study and understanding of the history, culture, and national identity of the former Soviet countries. He has conducted several interviews with specialists that have been published in Middle East News and independent media in Spanish, orientemedio.news. Our third participant, Dina Kudai-Bergen. She is a political sociologist based at the University of Cambridge. She writes about power relations and nationalism and democracies and autocracies. She also actively participates in decolonial dialogues across Eastern Europe, Eurasia, and Central Asia. Our next participant is Kimberly St. Julia Vernon. Kimberly is a doctoral candidate in history at the University of Pennsylvania. Her dissertation research focuses on the meanings and understandings of race, Blackness, and ethnicity in the Soviet Union and East Germany. Her public writing examines race, racism, and decolonization in Ukraine and Russia. Last but not the least, my colleague here, Sven Steinberg. Dr. Steinberg is a historian, teaches at the Department of History at Queen's in Kingston, Ontario, and is an affiliated researcher at the German Historical Institute in Washington, D.C., with its Pacific office at UC Berkeley in the US. Previously, Sven taught in the Migration and Diaspora Studies program at Carleton University in Ottawa. And Sven also serves as a research ambassador of the German Academic Exchange Service and joined the advisory committee of the Austrian Archive for Exile Studies and the Exile Library in Vienna in 2019. Sven's interests are located at the intersection of migration and knowledge, borderland networks, the history of social ideas, refugees from Nazi Germany and Nazi-occupied Europe, and especially unaccompanied minors. Those topics are mirrored in his teaching. Back in Germany, Sven also taught classes on colonial history, post-colonial theory, and started in 2010 the local student project, Dresden Post-Colonial. I'd like to welcome all of you to this symposium this afternoon. It's afternoon here in Kingston, and many of you might be in different time zones. So with that, let's launch the event. I'll hand over to Irina for the beginning of the proceedings.
Thank you so much, Professor Chaudhary. So now we can finally start our discussion, and I would like to briefly say to the audience, thanks for joining us. And we'll have a Q&A following as a discussion where you could ask your questions. So now you could keep your questions and ask them in person, or you could post your questions into the chat, and we will then come back to them later. So now I will start with the first question, and each participant will have briefly 3 minutes to discuss this question, and we will start from there. So my first question, how we framed it when we were thinking about this event, is to start addressing the question from the larger perspective. And usually decolonization is about making meaningful changes in different areas of life of the countries which either officially or formally had colonial status or even not. And it is not also just about discussion of political changes or their legacies, but also what we are looking forward to discuss with you about defining, articulating, and countering this discussion in public, academic, and social spaces. So we are interested to know about your own positionality, how you come to discuss these topics, and how your own research experiences and your approaches to decolonization from your respective fields, your countries of origin, your countries you are staying now, helped you to understand the specificity of this decolonization process. And also looking at the example of your respective country of your research, it would be also interesting to know about the experiences of these countries, like just briefly, and what has been achieved, and yeah, and your own perspective on this. Yeah. So you are welcome to unmute yourself or raise hand. What is most appropriate you think you can do? Yeah, everybody is so shy. Yeah, Manuel, please go ahead.
Thank you, Irina. Can you hear me? Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for this invitation. Can I share a little bit my presentation? I want to show you an example that, let me know when you see my presentation. Yes?
Yes,
Sven,
we
say
see it.
yes.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yes.
Perfect, Kimberly. So when Irina asked me about to be part of this panel, I was thinking about Ukraine as an example of how the decoloniality in Latin America fails to understand Ukraine as part of the decolonial process and intellectual imagination in Latin America. If you allow me, I will show you some slides. The answer, the question is, why does the Latin American Academy dedicated to decoloniality fail to understand the Russian invasion of Ukraine from that perspective? That's the question. What is decoloniality in Latin America? I briefly put the main topics in Latin America. I am sure all of you know, for instance, Aníbal Quijano, for instance. Aníbal Quijano is a very important voice in Latin America and worldwide. But the notion of coloniality of power is a very important concept of Quijano as pattern of global domination, typical of the modern capitalist world system, and this is the key, originated with European colonialists. In Latin America, we fail to understand Russia as a colonial and imperialist European power because the answer is very simple. We didn't suffer from the Russian coloniality. We suffer from the gringos, we suffer from Spain, we suffer from French. My country, for instance, was invaded for several countries. And see that. The fail of the Latin American Academy, the left-wing Latin American Academy to understand Ukraine as part of the global South, as part of the non-colonial world, Vladimir Putin 1 month ago Putin praises Mexico for its balanced approach. Come on, why? This is a very good cartoon from Fritz Behrendt. I know if you can see the cartoon. The cartoon is focused in how the USSR take advantage of the wave of decolonization in Asia and Middle East, but also in Latin America to promote communist ideology in those newly independent countries. Behrendt speculates on the future of the decolonized countries represented by a group of 4 people you can see in the bottom of the cartoon. Asian woman, a man with a turban wearing a traditional Indian costume, a black man in the babu, and Muslim in Bedouin dress. So 2 months ago, the Congress in Mexico opened the Grupo de Amistad, friendship group of Mexico with Russia. Come on. And let me show you this to finish my first opinion. See this table of opinion. Which countries are at the bottom of the list? Colombia and Mexico. Of all of those countries that was part of this survey, Colombia and Mexico show the less support to Ukraine. Why? In the next participation of myself, I will show you some examples of the left-wing academy, Decolonization Academy in Latin America, especially in Chile and Mexico, to show you why the Russian propaganda is working very good in Latin America, but also why Ukraine is failing to show as part of the East European countries, as part of the decolonization process. So my first opinion is that, Irina, in Latin America, we fail to understand the colonialist and imperialist characteristics of Russian imperialism. So the Russian propaganda is very active in our countries, and especially inside the academy elites. So thank you, friends.
Wonderful. Thank you, Manuel. I would like to invite probably like people that appear in the order of my screen. Maybe Sven, could you provide your opinion on the first question?
Yes, of course. Again, Irina, thanks so much for inviting me. So I'm Sven. I'm actually based in Canada. I'm originally from East Germany. I was trained in Germany. So, and this is kind of related to the perspective I'm providing here and what relates me to the topic. And there are 2 aspects I would like to talk about a little bit briefly, and what post-colonial thinking means to my research on the one hand and my teaching on the other. And this is probably something we should discuss as well here. How to implement critical thinking and so on. So one of my areas of expertise is migration and knowledge, this kind of an intersection. And then, of course, I'm also teaching German history. And both are related to the topic of this panel. So when we think about migration and knowledge, and Amitav already talked about this, we always think about or have to think about translation, losses in translation, and also ignorance. This is not just a transmission from one place to another, or from the colonial center to the periphery. We might touch upon this as well. It's a much more complex process we can discover in global history, and I'm pretty much interested in exactly those perspectives that are more related to interpretation and translation related to language and other aspects. And this brings me already to an aspect I've mentioned, how to implement this into teaching. So in my teaching, when I teach courses about migration and minorities. Especially, I of course include primary sources from indigenous voices and so on and so on. That helps me and help the students to understand, for example, that there is always a different perspective and maybe bodies of knowledge that have been ignored by colonial historiography and so on and so on. So this is the first aspect I wanted to mention. I don't want to give you a lecture about German colonial history. I think Germany is a very specific case. And I would say the past 20 years have been very interesting in Germany. They are similar to some other Central European countries, I would say, when it comes to achievements, because this is something, Irina, you already asked about as well. So I would say there is a critical discourse about the colonial past and to aspects that are related to the colonial past, including migration, racism, integration, all those kind of bigger concepts. So this is something I could see. There could be achieved much more, but when you look into the landscape of museums, for example, it's nearly impossible at the moment, I would say, in Germany to circumvent this topic, which is a good thing, and still we have to evaluate what it really is. And what's the approach is here, and who is reached by those aspects. One last thing I wanted to catch up with Manuel already. When we think about colonialism from a global perspective, I think what we need and what we should foster is a more critical approach to imperialism, and what this means until our present times. And therefore, Russia is a very good example, because coming from this German perspective, many people don't recognize this as maybe something that is related to imperial thinking that is coming from, I don't know, centuries ago. And this is something that interests me as well. So how vital is this kind of thinking, even if it is a remembrance of an imperial past, of a colonial past? How relevant is it until today? I would say it is much relevant. This is where history matters, where historical knowledge matters. And again, coming from this German perspective, this is something I really miss in this entire debate. From the German perspective, for many people, this is just another war. But I would say there's a broader context. And this broader context is also related how we situate ourselves as a German society to our own past when it comes to colonialism and imperialism. So some takeaways for the beginning.
Wonderful, Sven. Thank you so much for finding connections with Manuel's presentation. So now I would like to ask Diana to join the first round of discussion.
Can I pass my word to Oksana? I think it's more valuable to hear from Ukrainian side first.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you, Irina, for organizing this and inviting me. A month ago, I attended a conference in Vilnius about decolonization in Ukraine and Belarus. And the discussions I had with many excellent colleagues from the region made me think about the differences in approaches to decolonization in Ukraine and North America, and why it can sometimes be challenging to build a dialogue between scholars of Ukraine and from Ukraine and colleagues from different geographic regions, as just Manuel pointed out. I think that also catalyzed by Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in North America, the decolonization of Eastern European studies is primarily an intellectual exercise, relegated to somewhat fringe academic discussions that hardly have any impact beyond the field of Eastern European, Soviet, and Russian studies. In comparison, and that's what I learned from my colleagues in Ukraine, for scholars of and from Ukraine, decolonization is not purely an intellectual exercise. It's also a corporeal activity. And Daria Cymbaluk wrote an excellent article titled "What My Body Taught Me About Being a Scholar of Ukraine and from Ukraine in Times of Russia's War of Aggression." And in this article, she reminds us that the war and its violence continue to live in our bodies, and we as scholars of Ukraine and from Ukraine speak from this experience too. But this, and this will be my final point here, does not mean that we are being too emotional or so focused on our pain that we are incapable of producing objective work. Instead, our understanding of decolonization is informed by a more diverse methodological toolkit that is based not only on intellectual ruminations, but also on analysis of our feelings and our bodies. So in other words, we draw on the archives of feelings and bodies. And therefore, from scholars of and from Ukraine, decolonization is a very, as I said, physical process that is sometimes quite painful and uncomfortable. So when we as scholars discuss decolonization and want to build a meaningful dialogue amongst one another, I think that it's really important to take this corporeal dimension of decolonization into account. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Oksana. We indeed could find lots of references. I'm thankful that you acknowledged Daria's recent article. It's really one that people working in this field have to read to understand another area how these topics could be discussed and what researchers are going through while working on this field and where they come from this region as well. We also have time to address this question, and I hope that Kimberly and Diana also wanted to join us. So who would like to continue?
I think Diana's pointing to me. Thank you, Diana. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to Queen's University. And so I am an interloper in a lot of ways, in that I am from rural Southeast Texas. My accent makes that very clear if you're from the United States. And so I grew up in a poor rural area, and I'm an African-American woman. And so in many ways, Soviet and Eastern European history is not my history. And the way it's been taught, and the way I've been taught, and the way it's been studied, I should not be here doing what I do, but I do. And so I work on race and ethnicity in the Soviet Union in East Germany, but my master's thesis was on the Holodomor and subjectivity in the Soviet Union. And so the way I think about in approach decolonization, it comes from that positionality of being a perpetual outsider in the field that I've dedicated my life to, not only the field, but also to the countries that I've dedicated my life to studying. And so I have, since February 2022, I've become a public voice. And so when I think about decolonization, my approach to that is not just rooted in the academy, it's rooted in the public. Because since I started college, have been annoyed by the fact that so many of the debates that we're having inside the ivory tower never come out. And when they do come out, it's at the worst time, and it's always misunderstood and kind of misappropriated, often for the wrong ends. And so when I approach decolonization, it's rooted in that need for the public to understand what we're doing, because honestly, I don't see a point in discussing decolonization of our syllabi and our approaches to studies if this is only going to be relegated to conversations of college educated people, which most people don't have access to that type of education. And so coming from a background in Soviet history and East German history, but also my thinking is rooted in Africana studies and Black studies, I kind of approach decolonization, particularly in Ukraine and Eastern Europe, as a three-pronged problem. And I've written about this, about how so few people outside of Eastern Europe are able to see Ukraine's fight against Russia as a fight against colonialism, as a fight against imperialism, because of Russia's imperial innocence, Russia's ability to say, we didn't participate in the scramble for Africa, we didn't participate in the opium wars and things like that. So we don't have a footprint of colonialism. So it's one of the benefits of being a contiguous empire. But on the other hand, I've also seen how in discussions, and these are new discussions of decolonization and for my field, that isn't saying that people from the Caucasus, from Central Asia have not been having these discussions for decades. It's only now that Soviet history and Slavic studies have actually been paying attention. It took the invasion of Ukraine for us to see this as a catalyst, to have these conversations about the way we're thinking about these issues. But coming from a background as a Black woman rooted in Black thought, I've also paid attention to how when we talk about decolonization in the field now, we're often trying to recreate the wheel. We aren't paying attention to the century of writing by scholars that are now from the global South who've been thinking through these issues, talking about these issues, facing these issues. And so that also leads to this other issue. What is Eastern Europe, right? Understanding that Eastern Europe itself is a construct, and it implies both proximity and otherness. The Eastern part is the othering of Europe, but also the European part of Eastern Europe implies a proximity that makes studying decolonization in Eastern Europe, which was split by contiguous empires, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, that makes that history of colonization imperialism look different than what we traditionally see as histories of imperialism. But also that means we have to think about new ways to approach decoloniality and to think about what does it mean to decolonize a place that is both proximate to Europe and also othered as non-European? And so these are kind of the three ways that I'm approaching these questions in my public work, in my public-facing work, but also in how I'm looking at race and ethnicity and Blackness in the Soviet Union and East Germany is coming from a place where Blackness does not necessarily mean skin, African phenotype. That understand that there are different categories of Blackness that live and change and move depending on where you are in the Soviet Union or East Germany, and to kind of use these ideas from African studies, from decolonization studies, to enthuse and to work on these issues in Eastern Europe, but also to show that specificity and historical context of Eastern Europe means we have to expand our understandings of diaspora, but also coloniality in the region.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kimberly, for such a rich introduction. I think we will move now to Diana.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Irina, and the organizers for inviting me. It's incredibly inspirational to listen even to the start of the discussion, and I'm really, really happy to be here and learn from you guys. So thank you so much. Yeah, it's hard to be the last on the introductory notes, but and especially after Kimberly, it was amazing. Thank you. Yeah, what I wanted to say is, positionality is a very important point, and we can be, in different points of homeness, and that's what I and a group of my friends and scholars from widely defined Central Asia talk about in a lot of our own research, but also collectively we speak about the home without the quotation marks that can be expandable. And I think in that particular understanding of home, different people who were not even born there can find their place and can find their homeness. And our understanding of home has always been decolonial, in a sense that we have acknowledge and understand that the power relation of coloniality, even when an empire is broken down or is gone, or colonialism supposedly is gone, on the paper, still continues to influence the hierarchical, the racialized and ethnic gender relations and all sorts of other sort of domineering positions of, unfortunately, incredibly normalized language of seeing certain regions beyond Russia as its backyard, as its underbelly, as its sphere of influence. Even I find it sometimes quite painful for the people back at home to read these things. And in different periods of time, I've even seen that type of language naturalized and very much normalized in Russian press and Russian, discourse when they were talking before the wars, actually before 2014, about Ukraine and not just about Central Asia. So that particular understanding in itself already brings this coloniality, where we, for some reason, have a very central place that everybody's interested in, and that is widely defined Russia, but narrowly understood Moscow. And then everything that sort of forms that part of history becomes its backyard or becomes its underbelly that is less important. And I don't like to use that word, but a lot of people also use this peripheral to what Russia represents. So in that sense, I agree with everything that everybody said before me, is that when we're dealing with that, even with our positionality and our existence or defending our home, we're dealing with a number of different fronts that we need to kind of define and underline. And we're also dealing with an incredible level of hierarchization and inequality that this type of language and this type of domination brings with it. That not only you have to prove that you're not Russian because your last name may have the colonial ending of your, because that's how everybody was called at that time. Another thing, you have to defend that you're no longer post-Soviet, because what does post-Soviet even mean? And then you also have to, for example, in the case of Latin America, defend yourself to a decolonial field, saying that we're not just borrowing your terms, we're actually enriching it with understanding the Soviet Union or Russia had what Kosymbekova and Kimberly are working on as a concept of imperial innocence, but also continuously have this imperial innocence and its imperial presence very much worked out now in what we're seeing in Ukraine and other sort of dealings of Russia. I'm also trying to speak on behalf of the indigenous populations that are non-Russians and how they are entangled in this debate and how their voices often are seen not only as peripheral, but actually peripherally peripheral, that they're completely secondary or tertiary to the discussions that we are having here. And I think it's very unfortunate, and it shouldn't be like that. It's very unequal. So what I wanted to say is that I think another problem, and I hate to start with the identification of a problem that I've heard a lot, in passing, because I'm quite busy, but I heard people discussing, is that mentioning decolonial, mentioning that the Soviet Empire was the Soviet Union was an empire, is considered in some of our fields or interdisciplinary fields as being equal to being a Russophobe or hater of Russia or anything like that. And I think it is completely kind of like what I call is the kind of the imperial scholarly gaslighting, because it also brings us to this understanding that there's only universal, but also one unilinear, basically one particular purview of how we need to see the very complex phenomena of Soviet history, of what Soviet Union meant, of Russia's complex imperial past and present, but hopefully not its imperial future. And it really sort of closes us down in this box where we all have to agree with each other, and which actually goes against the scholarly debates and the nature of scholarly discussion and the nature of what we're doing, whether it's the public facing or, and I don't like to see academia as in only stuck in the ivory tower. I hope that our work is really also pans out in the communities that we're working with, and that we have responsibility to relate back the things that we discussing and analyzing with them. That's at least how I see my work, is that it's constantly in dialogue with people. I'm co-creating and co-writing in all of my findings. So, and I think it's very unfortunate, not unfortunate, but also unfair to these communities as well. If I go to my communities of decolonial artists in Kazakhstan or in Central Asia, and I tell them, it equals for you to be Russophobe, and of course that's not how they see themselves. And they only when they're trying to say that the decolonial, when they're trying to imbue it with a lot of interesting localized meaning, which is also very important, they just try to say that it's the type of unequal and hierarchical relation that they always have experienced, whether they were born in Soviet Union, whether they lived in that period of time, and even after it collapses. And that idea of coloniality is something that they were trying to find a language to understand, because they always felt that something was wrong, that they were always considered to be secondary or tertiary type of great citizens and so on within their own state when it was Soviet Union, but they didn't really have the type of vocabulary to define what it was. So I think for us, it's a starting point. I'm a big proponent from that field to say that we're not just borrowing, but we're also enriching that concept. And of course, decolonial in its pluriversal understanding actually allows for these dialogues to be, taken widely, but also not to make. I also, try to think that not everything should be decolonial and that it shouldn't be lost of the initial meaning. But in the sense, I think it's very, very important that, again, it's not the borrowing, and it doesn't equal being a hate of Russia. It just means to be offering a different type of view. And I think that type of sort of reading of Soviet Union or Soviet history as imperial in its own kind of imperialism is very important. And I think that a lot of the voices that are currently active in Central Asia or wider Eurasia, and that were active even before the war, the full-scale invasion and the war. I think it's very, very important not to sort of downgrade them and completely sort of downgrade their effort and their very creative input into very much basically expanding the dialogue and offering their own analysis and the reading of their own experiences and their livelihoods within the empire and later after the empire collapses but its coloniality continues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana. It's really a very stimulating first round of discussion, and many of you have briefly touched already many of the topics that we are planning to discuss in the following round of questions. And I think that we are already come to the very important point of discussion, the next round of questions, and I am giving the floor to Professor Chaptari to introduce these questions and invite you for the second round.
Thanks, Irina. The next round of questions, the next set of questions are about definitions. Definitions that help in changing the earlier constructed narratives and approaches in your fields. The discussion about the use of terminology and definitions to talk about and study the region is one of the topics of debate among those who support the process of decolonization of East European and Russian studies, and those who want to preserve the status quo. The current debates are, in particular, referring to the use of such terms as periphery and about naming the region as Eastern Europe. What examples are relevant to your area of expertise? Should geography be used as a defining feature for making sense of the region or area of study? Could you tell us about your take on this problem and post-colonial and post-imperial? Can you have decolonization when there was not a colonial state before? What is at stake in framing a country as colonial? Can you have decolonization without colonialism? Part of the thing that I was referring to in my introduction. Let me go to Oksana first. I'll go around the panel alphabetically for this round.
Okay, thank you so much. To start off, I don't think that there is a particular issue with the term like periphery or Eastern Europe. So if you are a historian of empires, you of course study centers and borderlands and peripheries. However, I see a problem when scholars essentialize the terms like periphery, for instance. When we generically label Ukraine as a borderland or periphery, what do we really mean? A borderland of what? And for instance, I study Ukrainian Galician soldiers of the Habsburg army during and after the First World War. So when the soldiers crossed the former Habsburg Romanovs imperial border, traveled to newly formed Ukraine and visited Kyiv, they did not see it as entering the borderlands, but rather as a journey to the center. So, and when something is named a periphery, it is always important to consider who has labeled it as such and why, and what we consider and what they consider to be the center. And of course, the politics of naming, which you already mentioned, and the right to name are highly linked to the power. And it's so important in decolonization to recognize various places not as peripheries but as centers in their own right. And just one example of a recent, in my opinion, powerful decolonization moment in Ukraine is the change how trains and kilometer markers on Ukrainian railways are numbered. Because in the Soviet Union, the numbering of trains was based on the view that Moscow was the center, and this numeration lasted until recently, actually until 2023. So now the Ukrainian Railways has changed this and started to number its trains from Kyiv. So in other words, peripheral Kyiv has become a center. And I think I'll stop here.
Thanks, Oksana. I'll go to Manuel next.
Thank you, Amitabha. I was listening all of you, and it's very sad to see how the Latin American Academy focused in the colonization process failed to understand all these issues that do talk about. I want to give you an example. I live in Chile. Here in Chile, we have the biggest Palestinian diaspora in the world. Hundreds of thousands of people in Chile came from Palestine. So in the political and academic imagination, the decolonization process is about Palestine. Let me give you an example with my presentation. It's the biggest example as Amitabha requests for us. I will show you a very... Did you see my presentation? Okay. Here's Pablo Jofre. Pablo Jofre is a very famous journalist and academician to talk about Palestinian in Chile. But please, Diana, read the idea of Jofre about Crimea. It's an article. He published this article in Universidad de Chile, the biggest university in Chile. What do you think, Diana, about this decolonization academic who is fighting for the Palestinian, but fails to understand not only Ukraine, but also Crimea? What is the problem with Jofre, Diana?
A lot of problems. I guess where does he start with legality? But yeah. And ritorno, it's like such a bad word. I'm sorry.
The problem, Diana, with Jofre and several Latin American academicians is that Latin America understands perfectly our own decolonial process. We understand perfectly the Palestinian decolonial process, but we don't have enough information. We don't have books. My friends, sincerely, I have more books about modern Ukraine in my house here than in my university library, for sure. In this round of aggression from Russia versus Ukraine, I went to my library to see how many books about Eastern Europe we have in my university. And it's a very good university, a private one. We have a lot of books about Palestinian, about etc. But we don't have enough information about Eastern Europe. We don't have any books about Central Asia, for instance, nothing about Kazakhstan, nothing about Crimea, zero. So the problem, my friends, is that in Latin America, we don't have enough information to start the process to think about the decolonization in Eastern Europe. We don't have academicians, we don't have a diaspora, we don't have Ukrainians in Chile, we have a lot of Palestinians in Chile. We can imagine the Palestinian. We cannot imagine Ukrainians because we don't deal with Ukrainians. I don't know if I am clear in my answer to Amitabha. The problem in Latin America is more profound, is more deep. The problem is that we cannot start to think about the decolonization in Eastern Europe because we lack enough information inside our academy. So we have this Frankenstein, a strong supporter of the decolonization from the Palestinians. He's talking about the Russian imperialism in Crimea. This is only one example. I have several more from Mexico, from Colombia. I finished here, Amitabha. I asked several students from Colombia, from Chile, from Mexico. None of them told me one Ukrainian name. Zero names. So we have a very, we are in problem, Diana, here in Latin America to understand the other, because as I say, we are very good to understand our own history, our own colonialist history, our own independence process, but we don't have enough tools to start to understand the other. So that's my long answer, Amitabha.
Thank you for that, Manuel. Your response reminds me about a specific strand of German philosophy in the 1960s, and the idea that you can only imagine within the realm that you're exposed to, and you are not capable of engaging with the universe that we are not really a part of. I'll move to Diana now for the next set of responses.
Thank you, and thank you, Manuel, for that perspective. It's it's disheartening to see that newspaper, unfortunately, and that brings me to this idea of sort of when you mentioned the tools in your closing, can we break the master's house with the master's tools? And I think that's the question that I often go back to, sort of like, to this idea of Sovietness, and that's why I think we need to separate Soviet Union from the concept of Sovietness. And what Sovietness brought to us in the form of normalizing the type of colonial relations, even in the form of our identities and categories of thinking structures, because even Amitabh in the beginning mentioned how important the structures and categories of knowledge are. And if these are brought up, in a violent way, again, I try to give a brief introduction, but basically working with communities that were dispossessed of their lifestyle and I come from the part of Central Asia that was nomadic until the Soviets came in and basically colonized the land, but also colonized the people, colonized everything that came with that, including animals, including lifestyles and livelihoods, and made them live in, again, collective farms that were very rigid in their forms, that had a very contrasting idea of space, of dealing with nature, for example, which is also very important for not only indigenous, but also decolonial thought, and how people relate to the specific space and land and nature that surrounds them. All of that was completely destroyed. And all of that was, in a way, erased, and then the history was rewritten so that people who live in those lands, people who survived that violence, that followed up with the famine, that followed up with the war, the World War II, that kind of like, was supposed to bridge that understanding of we fighting the patriotic war for the union and for the state that we belong to. All of that history is usually like, meshed up in a very short kind of like, crash course in understanding what Central Asian history means. And again, Central Asia is too huge of a region to try to understand it just through its nomadic perspective, and how dispossession of land and dispossession basically of the specific way of living and dispossession of essentially the culture of people. It happened in similar violent way in other places, both places were, for example, more urban, sedentarized, and so on, but it essentially happened. And I think, again, it's something that even remains forgotten. If you ask, forget about Chile, ask somebody in Russia, in Moscow, if they know what happened in 1933. Equally as it happened in Ukraine for Holodomor, but there was a very different and distinct reason for that. Similar things happened in Kazakhstan when a lot of third of the population back then died from the famine as well. And all of these stories are very difficult to uncover, and that's what I'm saying. That in a lot of my interviews, I was often driven to this understanding. How people told me how we live in this understanding of cultural amnesia, because essentially we lost the way of knowledge and we lost the way of living that generations prior to us, and the way that they formed the specific culture and our land were thinking. And it's not, another thing that is usually attacked through that is sort of like, oh, you're only interested in your own national traumas, you're trying to nationalize this question, you're trying to build off a nationalist understanding and so on. It's like, every time you go into any potential critical discussion of the imperial history and even try to understand it as imperial as such, you immediately, following all these traps, again, set up by the Soviet categorization and by the Soviet type of language, sort of like everything that becomes, a little bit inwardly looking, a little bit self-reflexive of the very tragic and traumatic history becomes the point of nationalization. But for me, I think coming back to some of these interviews with people and thinking why and how they think of that colonial and violent history is very, very important, even for themselves to understand and find that type of language. But I think, yes, we're a bit late to the party. maybe because for a very long time we normalize it for ourselves, and I do critically look into that, and I think about that myself. But I think and hopefully we will start translating our work into Spanish, into Portuguese, into Quechua and other languages. So hopefully, and I'm very much part of that debate, and I hope it will continue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana. Let's go to Kimberly next.
So this is an interesting question, and I've been thinking through this, but I think kind of the starting point is that what Manuel's discussing, the lack of knowledge of other forms of imperialism, of coloniality, and the ways in which we can understand our own histories and backgrounds of trauma and oppression, but it's often hard to translate those into other experiences. And I would argue that this isn't just a Latin American issue. You can also see the reverse, in which Eastern Europeans have trouble understanding the specific colonialities that people of Latin American, Asian, and African descent have experienced. And I think this goes back to this idea of Russian imperial innocence, right? Because the Soviet Union represented to of many of these decolonizing countries an opportunity to escape European colonialism. So if you have that framing of understanding your liberation was possible, only possible in contradistinction to Europe, then when we get to today, in which you see Ukraine fighting Russia and Ukraine standing upon the pedestal of Europeanness and fighting for Europeanness, it's often hard for those countries that were colonized by Europe to see Europe as any type of liberatory force. So I think I see it often, this kind of cross reading of each other and this inability to understand that liberation has different meanings and different ways of being attended to and obtained, depending on your colonial history. And so Eastern Europe is so difficult for a lot of people to understand because it's an internalized empire. How do you detangle empire, and it's particularly colonization, when often it's understood in the context of settler colonialism? But for a lot of Eastern Europe, the settler element isn't there. And if we go into Central Asia, we talk about Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, and the Caucasus, that does look a little bit different, Russian imperialism. But for a lot of people, the colonial other isn't clearly marked when you go to Eastern Europe. And so I think we have a lot of these issues of kind of untangling and really working through and defining and being specific in what we mean by elements of decolonization, settler colonialism, imperialism. And when we think about, particularly, I'm fascinated by this concept of, Fanon talks about decolonization as an inherently violent act. It requires the destruction of the colonial. And did we see that in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union? We didn't. So I think one of the ways in which Russian imperial innocence continues is the fact that in post-1991, we didn't see a violent collapse of empire. We're seeing, I would argue, the violence now. We're seeing it between Armenia and Azerbaijan, between Russia and Ukraine. We're seeing the violence now, but that allows for 30 years people to imagine the Soviet and post-Soviet as something that's outside of empire, because it doesn't work. It doesn't function the way we think empire should, because our understanding of empire is often dominated by Europe. The same inability to see empire that we see in Russia has described the historiography of the United States for decades. The refusal to see and engage with imperial thought and to think through what does it mean to be an imperial state. And so when I think about this question of, can you have decolonization without colonialism? My initial response is, then what are you decolonizing? What is being changed? What is being shifted? If we go with Fanon, decolonization is a violent act, but I don't think it's just physical violence. It's epistemologically violent. It requires the destruction of terms and categories of thought and fonts of thought. And so what I'm looking forward to, and what I really see with Eastern Europe, particularly with Ukraine, but not just Ukraine, I think Central Asia should equally be part of this conversation, so should the Caucasus. And then a question becomes, if Uzbekistan was invaded in February 2022, would the decolonization conversation happen? And if we were not having that conversation, what about the ways in which we think about coloniality and Russian power have shaped that, right? And so I think that going forward, particularly in my field, where we have this conversation of, if you are decolonizing, you're anti-Russia, then that means people's understandings of Russia is only inhabited by the imperial. And we need to unpack what that means. If a Russian culture, of Russian literature, of Russian history can only be used for empire, then we have a problem and a lack of imagination in our work. And so that's the way I'm looking at it. But yeah, thank you. So like, I'm writing so many notes. I'm an academic, I'm writing tons of notes because everyone's making so many good points.
Thank you for your very helpful comments, Kimberly. Sven.
I try to make it brief, and we already have some people in the audience that want to weigh in. We started with this question of terminology and narratives. So we started with the peripheries, and thank you, Oksana, for this very interesting example. I will think about. I mean, is it useful to work with this kind of terminology? I think this is nothing we have to discuss. We all know that those are constructions and those are narratives that were implemented for a specific reason. But coming back to Amitabh's point, when thinking about knowledge, structures of knowledge, this is related to power structures, and this is where historical inquiry is coming in. So why are specific regions marginalized, and why did people in the past talk about it as marginalized, even though when you look a little bit deeper, for example, in what I'm doing with this intersection of migration and knowledge, well, you already learn, I don't know, 500 years ago, we don't talk about peripheries. Those were centers, and knowledge structures and exchanges were a little bit different than we thought for a long time. And the question is more, why are we doing this still? The other question was about geography. I have a couple of ideas here, and I'm not the Eastern European historian. I would like to turn this question upside down. This is because I think this is probably something we also have to keep in mind. So to what extent does geography remains as a factor, for example, of identity in those regions we are talking about? So I introduced to you myself as East German. And I realized this when I was listening to your very helpful comments. Again, this is coming with a different question. So it's not just that now I'm based in Canada, looking from the West, that we talk about something that is in the East, which doesn't make any sense because the globe is round, could be in the West as well. That's not the point, but the self-location from a perspective of identification, this is something we really have to keep in mind here as well when we talk about this. And the last question, or the last topic, is about this very interesting question about decolonization when there was no colonial state before, because this is something I started thinking about when preparing for our conversation. I don't really have a convincing example, but after the reunification of Germany, after the wall came down and the Cold War ended, you had a huge debate in East Germany that East Germans felt colonized by West Germans. Yet we can discuss whether this is a colonial project and so on, and there is a colonial past in German history as well, and that we all know this. But I started thinking about exactly this because I don't really have knowledge how people, for example, in Poland or in Czechoslovakia or in Hungary experienced exactly this time, and we are talking about 10 years. I would say. So I think this shifted around the 2000s when this discourse became a little bit different. But in my opinion, this is coming exactly with this question Kimberly at least also posed. So there are different forms of violence. We also have to think about experience that is probably not so much visible in the first place when it comes to such experiences. So again, very vague. Last point is very vague, but this is something that came to my mind and that still strikes me. Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Sven. This has been a rather illuminating round for me. I mean, one of the things that I understood was the centrality of positionality in any kind of definitions and exercises of term making. And the process of colonialism is experienced very differently by different people, even within the same colony. And therefore, definitions serve more as a scaffold than anything else. And the problem begins when you reify that and make it actually as if it really exists. So that's very helpful. I think staying on that theme of terms and definitions, let's enter the next round. I'm looking at the time, it's 4:10, and we have 3 more rounds to go, and hopefully some discussion with the audience. So I would request you to maybe stay within 2-3 minutes for your responses. So this next round is about applying the terms post-Soviet and post-socialist. Should the temporal connection to an earlier established political regime, which has already collapsed, be used as a defining feature for the region or area of study? How long is enough for the region country to be named a post? How much time should elapse before we can call it a post? Could you provide examples from your area of expertise, how naming practices of the region country could be helpful in the attempts to decolonize the area studies? What are the limits of applicability of these models to your field? Where are the tensions developed in different contexts to places officially as colonies to your fields? What is to be gained from this? What are the vantage points? What happens when we apply post-colonial towards post-socialist? And what is the value of these terms in your fields? What is the value of these terms and status of these terms in your fields? So with that, maybe if you don't mind, I'll switch the order a little bit and go to Diana first.
Yeah, I'm thinking a lot about it. And I think in something that I should publish soon, I talk about the idea of how we are lost in all of these posts. And they are always given to us from the outside. It's rarely when you go into the city, like, in Tashkent, Ashgabat, or Almaty, in varying degrees, that somebody would say, oh, we are post-Soviet or we are post-socialist. And actually, it doesn't at all enter the frame of the localized languages, whether you speak Kazakh, Turkmen, Uzbek, Tajik, or any other. And even the term post-socialist is a lot, like, it's actually never mentioned. In the political language, equally, nobody calls ourselves post-Soviet from the leaders. So I'm talking about the domestic sort of, like, even regional language. We never think of Central Asia as post-Soviet. Equally, I work in the Baltics. Nobody calls themselves post-Soviet there either. And it's just like, it's always been something that was given to us from the outsiders. It's a very catchy frame to sort of, like, call everybody but Russia post-Soviet, because Russia is never considered to be post-Soviet, right? We never say the book is titled so and so in post-Soviet Russia. It's always Russia, most of the cases. So it's a very interesting point that Russia stands alone as its big actor, big phenomena, and so on. And everybody else has to be, in order to be even put on the map, have to be understood through this frame, sort of like, oh, they were once these ex-Soviet republics. They were once, with Russia, and now suddenly they have their own independence. And I think it creates a sense of type of internal political insecurity. I mean, on the societal level, people don't really think about these terms. They maybe think about, welfare and socialism, but they don't think about it in these particular terms. Even people, and I'm really interested in people who are nostalgic for Soviet Union, the older generation, even they don't see, they don't call communism or socialism as such. They call it through these terms of sort of Sovietsky, Sovietness, and that's why I'm like, advocating for a separate term of Sovietness rather than post-Soviet, because it's something that lives in people's minds, and it's something that they clearly identify, but they never say post, because for a lot of people who would love to live in this nostalgia land, a lost land that they imagine, there is no post there, and they still, try to. I mean, again, I'm writing about it. They still try to create the frames of that world. So post-Soviet is really, again, it's a term that is useful for people outside to understand and define the region. But for the people on the inside, it never made sense. We would never post something. It was immediately independence, golden age, or back to our great history, but never post. So I think in those temporal understandings in general, it's really cool to see how there's great history. There's something in between that people try to avoid calling anything really, but it's the Soviet period, and then all of a sudden we're back to our golden history. Yeah, it's kind of like a lapsed and non-linear understanding of time, if you want.
Thank you, Diana. Why don't we go to Kimberly for the next response?
I am being good and I have my timer on. So I've been thinking about post-Soviet and what it usually means. Generally, if I'm talking to someone who doesn't work in the region, I say I work on the former Soviet Union. So people know I work on a lot of countries east of Germany. But inside of area studies, and we're thinking about post-colonial, post-Soviet, I think, as Diana said, this really important point, very few people refer to Russia as post-Soviet. Also, because if you look at public culture in America, a lot of people still think Russia is communist. They still think of Russia stood in for ideas of the Soviet Union. I've even argued with some American historians about why did they refer to every decision being made in the Soviet Union as Moscow or the Kremlin. When you're talking about Ukraine in 1944, that's not Moscow or the Kremlin, right? So we're fighting these internal battles of decoloniality, but also trying to educate some of our colleagues who have PhDs in history who are still using these colonial terms, and also trying to educate the public about all of these things. But I'm thinking about my area of expertise, and post-Soviet to me implies an ending of a process that isn't over. The Soviet Union as a political entity collapsed, but the modes of understanding yourself, your community, and your connections to each other and to other regions and to worldwide internationalism, I think that very much lives, not only in Ukraine, Russia, the Caucasus, Central Asia, but also in how other countries view the region. And when we talk about Russian imperial innocence, that is allowed to live on because of these ideas of Soviet internationalism, the Drushba Narodov, right? Those ideas that were put into the world by the Bolsheviks still live on. They've taken on different meanings, but they're still connected to that Soviet political entity. So we think about, is Russia post-Soviet? Is Ukraine post-Soviet? Is Uzbekistan post-Soviet? They have survived the collapse of the Soviet Union, but the interconnectedness, be that through coercion or not, that still exists. So in some ways, I think that post-Soviet isn't really helpful because these connections haven't ended. But when it comes to shorthand, I'm talking about all of these, 15 different independent countries who are still dealing with each other. It's useful for me. But I'm also fascinated by this conversation of area studies, because this is something we've been talking about. My master's degree is in Russian, Eastern European, and Central Asian studies, right? Which we just say post-Soviet, everything east of Germany. But I'm interested in this question of, when we talk about area studies, we have to remember the point of area studies. Like, why do we have area studies in the United States? I'm speaking as an American academic. A lot of it comes from the Cold War and being able to understand the enemy and their movements to make better informed foreign policy. So when we think about post-Soviet or Soviet studies, which is what my field used to be called, it's to be able to further these points. So I'm interested in these conversations. Are Middle Eastern studies and East Asian studies or Southeast Asian studies, are they also having these conversations of what does it mean to have this big roof of such and such studies, and what does that mean to fall within that? But I'm over my time. I will pass the mic.
Thank you, Kimberly. Manuel.
I was listening to Diana and Kimberly, and I remember that for several decades in Latin America, we used the Iberoamerica term. And I was thinking that it's a very similar process with the post-Soviet concept, because when we change from Iberoamerica to Latin America, we change the focus from the Iberic Peninsula to ourselves. For example, Diana say in the chat, we also never say post-Ottoman. So this is a very good question. When I was in the master, we always say post-Soviet countries to all countries that were not part of the European Union, as Diana said. The Baltic states, no, they are not post-colonial. So I don't want to take too much time here, but I was thinking that this is a good example that we need to have more conversation between us, because in the Latin American, when we realized that Iberoamerica was a very bad concept, we struggle, and we are still struggling, to find a good way to name ourselves. For instance, North America, Mexico is part of North America, is part of Latin America, is part of Central America. I live in Chile. All the Chilean people don't see Mexico as part of any process, because for them, my country is part of other process with Canada, with United States. So all concepts have their own history. So the post-Soviet concept in Latin America is used in two ways, in a positive and a negative way. The positive way is a number of countries that are moving beyond that period of time, okay, beyond the Soviet times. And this is a positive way. But also several academicians use the term as part of Russia. So for me, it's very important to be here, because I need to learn how to deal with the concept of post-Soviet, because I made an interview with Oksana, I interview several people from those countries, and when I say the question, and I use the concept post-Soviet, all the interviewers say, Manuel, it's a bad concept. And I answer, okay, I don't have another concept to deal with all the diversities, Caucasus, is Central Asia, is et cetera, et cetera. So Iberoamerica, for answer Amitava, Iberoamerica is a very good example of how to deal with a bad concept, to move forward to new ways to think, to the Latin American experience, but also the European and Central Asian European experience. So that's my answer.
Thank you. I appreciate those responses. Sven?
Yeah, sure. I can make it short, because I agree with a lot of things that have already been said. I mean, post is coming with this kind of teleological framing. Something is over and something new is starting, and this is mostly not related to the life world and experiences of the people that are living in the regions we are talking about. And coming back to my German case, I'm pretty much familiar with since I grew up there. What is a more helpful term, still a little bit vague, but a term that is now becoming, I would say, part of the public debate in Germany, and also I would also say part of the identities is transformation. And a term that is much more focused on, okay, things are changing, maybe some things are not. Not everything has to transform when it comes to identities, for example, belonging and longing, coping strategies, and all those kind of things. I'm just saying, so this post combination is not helpful for analysis, and from this German speaking from this German perspective, not even to understand what is going on within the country, because things were not just over because the war came down. So that's simply not true. People were still alive, and I think this is the one aspect I wanted to highlight. You posed two terms. It was post-Soviet and post-socialist. And I think post-socialist is also an interesting term. Something that is, in my opinion, more a historical term from that might be interesting to analyze in its meaning in the 1990s. And then I talked not just about Germany, also about Poland, Czechoslovakia, or Czech Republic and Slovakia after 92, Hungary, and so on. Because in this context, I would say this post-Soviet, post-socialist had another interpretation and another impact in the political sphere. Because this was a marker to really point out that something is over. We are in the post situation, and we are no longer doing it than we did this before. I don't think this is strong anymore. I don't know this kind of related debate from Germany at the moment, but this is something you also have to consider or take into account when it comes to the history of this kind of terminology and where it is coming from. And it was already mentioned that we are sometimes using a terminology that dates back into the Cold War, and it's really questionable why we are still using it without questioning it critically. But again, this post-socialist aspect that was also interesting to me to think about what this really is.
Thank you, Sven. Oksana, you have the last word.
It's so interesting that I even forgot that I have to talk. I really think that my colleagues have a lot more to say about this question. Again, like I don't see any particular issue with the term post-Soviet if it used in a very specific context. For instance, if what just Kimberly mentioned, so for instance, if a scholar studies a post-Soviet coloniality and looks at the longevity of the Soviet legacy in culture or politics or economy, the term post-Soviet might be relevant if not necessary. However, when some scholars relegate the entire large and extremely diverse region to a small post-Soviet box without recognizing its pre-Soviet and not Soviet legacies, I think that it's very constraining. And again, I see this problem in area studies because the term post-Soviet has become not a term that describes a post-imperial condition, but rather a geographical term that limits our understanding of the complexity of the region.
Thank you, everyone. That brings us to the end of the third round. And behind the scenes, Irina and I have been chatting to find out what we should do the last half an hour. I think it's time for us to open up the panel for questions from the floor. And then if we run out of questions, we might come back to some of the other thoughts we had. But with that, let me turn it over to Irina.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really like, I also kept lots of notes and we'll come back to them later. I would like also to provide the audience some opportunity to interact with you and raise questions. And we have a couple of very important questions, and some of them are related to those that we already discussed, and they ask you to develop your thoughts in the directions that like we also initially were looking forward to. So I will ask a question raised first by Emily Couch. She's sending to you all. I think you everyone see it, or should I read it? Okay, I will read for the audience. So she's thankful to all speakers for your comments. And she works at the Freedom House on the Ukrainian program. Something I have already noticed, she wrote, is that many people who have embraced decolonization when it comes to Ukraine actually either reluctant or even resistant to the concept when it comes to other parts of the world or indeed in their own countries. Why do the speakers think this happens? How can we break down the intellectual silo? So you, if you are ready to answer, you can unmute yourself and follow this question. And yeah, in different order. Okay, please go ahead, Oksana.
I'll try to be very brief. And in my last article, I rely on Walter's Mignolo discussions of universality, and we briefly talked about this with Manuel before this the symposium. So probably I hope that my colleagues can add anything to this, but I still believe that there are many important things that the idea of universality can give us in terms of understanding decolonization. But I'd like to share just one example of these limitations. which also illustrates, for instance, how Mignolo himself applies this concept of pluriversality to Russia's war of aggression. Because for Mignolo, pluriversality is not only a new way of thinking about the world, but also a way to challenge the West-centered world. And therefore, for him, ironically, Russia and China and probably Iran are decolonial allies because they, as decolonial thinkers, also aim to create alternatives to the West. And I don't want to delve here in the paradoxes of such alignment between decolonial scholars and Putin's Russia, but what is curious here is that when Mignolo shifts his geographical gaze from the West to Eastern Europe, he sees only global geopolitical players and ignores smaller underrepresented voices such as Ukraine or Central Asia or the Caucasus. And what I think here is that this example shows that the concept of pluriversality as any other concept is dependent on a regime of visibility. So to imagine this kind of pluriversal world of many words, we must first see them. And it is impossible to include a region or peoples in a pluriversal world if we, if you simply do not notice them, or I do not want to recognize their importance. So for me personally, it's really important to train our epistemic eye and to see regions in peoples that are not highly visible in dominant narratives and structures. And learn from scholars from other areas, for instance, as from this symposium.
Manuel, yes, please go ahead.
About the second part of the question of Emily, what can we do? I will share one more time my presentation because I worked very hard with my presentation. So I want to show you my presentation, all my presentation. Did you see, Kimberly? What can we do? And Emily, I know you are listening to, this is my ideas, to increase academic production in Spanish, as we said before, on post-Soviet countries, about their independence, processes, culture, identity, and history. It's very important to talk about the post-Soviet countries, not only about the war with Russia, because it's so simple to talk only about the international relation approach. We need to talk with historians. We need to talk with sociologists. We have to talk with people from the museums, with the literature, art. Establish and study groups and research groups between Latin American academics and academics from Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, the second topic. And the third one, I think is a very important to talk about it. It's a very specific way to work in Latin America. The European Union established it in Latin America and other parts. Jean Monnet chairs. I am sure you know that Jean Monnet chairs. Look it in the Google, Kimberly. Was a very good way to deal with the lack of knowledge about the European Union process, but not only in the academic way, but also in the cultural way. And it's a very cheap and good way to deal with the unknown, okay? So create Jean Monnet type center focused on post-Soviet countries in some Latin American university. And of course, this is a very important way, establish constant exchange of scholars. We need people from Eastern Europe in Latin America. I am sure you need Latin American thinkers in Eastern Europe, and it's not so, we can deal with Zoom, with Meet, etc. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4 ideas, and I am sure that all of them are very viable to do it because we are moving in a very interconnected world. So I don't know if Emily is okay with the 4, but for me, the Jean Monnet chairs are a very clever and a very effective way to deal with this issue, that this is the lack of minimal information about the Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Caucasus. Really, my friends, we don't have books how to deal with this. We don't have books about those areas. So thank you. That's my answer to Emily.
Can I jump in? Okay, so I think Emily's question is also referring to, for a lot of people, particularly if you're on the various social media ecosystems, where it has become much easier for people to support Ukraine in their struggle against Russia than they have been towards other countries that are also going to those decolonial fights. But also more attention has been paid to Ukraine's fight than what we've seen in Syria, Yemen, the list goes on. And so I think that it's not just the global South being more open to understanding Ukraine's fight as decolonial. It's also the Western countries that support Ukraine, such as Germany, France, Britain, America, having to embrace and kind of deal with the unsettling elements that Ukraine's fight against Russia holds. And that means thinking about our own colonial histories, the histories of the West that are still rooted in colonialism. And so when people ask questions such as, like, why, and this is something I've seen a lot, like, why are we sending so much money to Ukraine when we have homeless issues in the United States? And so that's kind of still a binary thought, right? It's because the state has decided that it has funds for this, but it doesn't have funds for that. That often seems to be people turning against Ukraine, but actually we need to turn our ire and our understanding to what state systems have continued to allow these types of inequalities to exist. And they not only just exist in Germany and France and the United States, but also they exist in Ukraine. Ukraine has had these issues with poverty, LGBTQ issues, anti-Black racism, but it isn't just Ukraine that's had that issue. It's every country that's had that issue. But we have to really try to work on our understandings of each other, but also open the doors to understanding that not only is the North, like the Latin American and African and East European or Southeast Asian fight against colonialization, it's not just a bright line. The way Ukraine's doing it is also a way for us to understand it, but Ukraine should also look towards understanding that it too can learn from the global South and the ways in which they fought against colonization and dealt with imperialism. I think it's looking towards a wider ecosystem of understanding. So I think that's hopefully kind of gets into what Emily was thinking about.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. It's very stimulating to think along the lines with your thoughts. And I have a suggestion to move to another question from the chat. And those of you who have not addressed the previous question can start thinking about it so we keep on time. So this question comes from Professor Marko Pavlishin from Monash University. How do we move from diagnosis to action? The Institution of Eastern European and Eurasian Studies, post-Soviet studies, is Russocentric composition of university departments, courses, inertia of training specialists and developing academic careers, preponderance of publications and research projects. What strategies do the panelists envisage to a decolonial rebalancing of scholarship about the field? So very important question. So now we come to discussion about the infrastructure, how we should change and adapt infrastructure to reflect on all of these sort of questions that you already addressed. And yeah, if you have already any thoughts, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
I can go first. I've been thinking about this question a lot. I think one of the issues we have to grapple with is this isn't just about decolonizing the field. We're also having, in general, as academics, particularly those of us in North America, are having to fight against the neoliberal management consultant takeover of the academy. And like West Virginia University in the United States is a perfect example where they're closing all of the languages. And so it's not just Russian that's not being taught, it's not Russian, it's not Ukrainian, it's not German, it's not Spanish. So we're having to fight against this very idea that learning about places that are not in power isn't worthy of time and attention. And so that's one fight we're having to fight. I think it's also kind of being okay with and really grappling with the fact that in the United States, a lot of Soviet historians are trained as Russianist. We're Russianists in our training, we're Russianists in the languages that we read. And so it's using Moscow, you're hearing my dogs run around. It's our center of knowledge, thought, and research is often Moscow and state-produced archives. And so this is what I'm trying to grapple with as a graduate student, where we have less time to completion there's less funding for research. So for a lot of people, it's easier and it's more cost effective. And it's just, you're better able to do research on Russia and in Russia. That doesn't excuse it, but that's the situation that we're in now. And it's also, we have to show, unfortunately, because of the way we're looking at university, you have to show students, undergraduates, that it's worth their time to learn these languages. We're fighting, and it's not just Ukrainian. How many universities can you take Uzbek or Kazakh or Georgian or Armenian? So what we're doing is facing a field that has put so much time and resources in Russian, but also because of the Cold War, you needed to learn Russian to fight against the Soviets. And now we're trying to deal with that, but we're also having the time of, you only have 4 students in advanced Georgian. Why should we have this? All right, so we're fighting this all at once. And so I feel like in our individual work, in our research, we can branch out and think through and use some tools from other fields, like African American history, where you have to think about experiences that are not in state-based archives. That's perfect for Soviet history, to move away from a focus on Moscow. And so that's what I think we have to do. We have to draw from other fields. We have to draw from fields that have gone through these questions of how do you decolonize in a situation where you're so rooted in the state and how the state thinks. But it also means we have to collaborate. America and Canadian-based academics, we should be working with our Ukrainian and Uzbek and Kazakh colleagues. We have accesses to resources. We have brand names that they don't have access to. And one of the easiest ways for us to change that is to work with them and promote their work with them, assign their work, and expose our students to it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's really very important practical suggestions, and many of us can start doing from all of these small steps in our own field and our own research that first we can do. Sven, maybe we can go to you, so you will address this question, and then probably we'll quickly go to another question in the chat.
And I just wanted to underline what Kimberly already said. I mean, we are facing 2 problems, that we are coming from a past where we think about research in a lot of boxes that are unrelated, but on the other hand, and I agree fully here in North America, for example, when it comes to languages, we can see severe cuts that are not helpful at all to move on. From my own experience, and this speaks a little bit to your answer, Kimberly. I mean, I mentioned before that I teach about migration and minorities in lecture courses, and this already helps to bridge those kind of gaps between different fields, because this is what I simply have to do. I have to assign scholarship from a huge variety of other fields, because this is coming with this topic, and this is not really an answer to the question in the chat. That is more going into the institutional direction. I don't have an answer for this either. But it is, in my opinion, it is pretty much easy to implement it, and to open this kind of other perspectives that are going on in entirely different fields. But if they are topical related, you can include them. And this is what Kimberly said: make the scholarship visible, confront your students with it, and then you have to discuss it in class. And maybe this is already a starting point to open up this new kind of perspectives. So I just wanted to underline this.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sven. If you don't mind, if you do not have any pressing answers, we could move to another question. Comes from this time from Alexandra Tkacheva, and she wrote, "It seems to me like decolonial ideas first emerged through creative practices, art, fiction, film, before they make their way to academic and public discourses in the region. My view is rooted in Central Asia. Is this a far observation, or how you can explain this?" And I think this question is very related to our discussion and initial idea to bring more non-academic perspectives into the field, and to see how this discussion within academia could be more practical for our societies and for the region. And I think maybe Oksana could address this, given her experiences in the area, or any of you could also join.
I don't really know. I don't really know because I feel like for me it was like more like a simultaneous process because on the one hand, and I'm referring to my Ukrainian experience, on the one hand, like 10 or 15 years ago, we have totally new theater that emerged in Ukraine, which we might call like post-colonial. However, this like movement did not call it itself as such. And on the other hand, we had like a number of publications in scholarly journals that discussed like how to deal with the Soviet legacy and what to do it. So I really see it as a simultaneous process, and I believe that now it's also it also so because this summer I attended a theater workshop and we discussed the vocabulary of the future, and we had similar kind of conversations with people from Ukrainian theater, just we use different methods like body work and language and performing arts. Yeah.
I think it's a good observation, but also it shows the deep roots of decolonization, and that when we look at decolonization in former French colonies, it's often not just artists and performers. Fanon was a psychiatrist. He was seeing and witnessing and treating the psychological effects of colonization and colonial violence in his patients. So I think these kind of situations do tend to happen outside of the academy, because they're so rooted in lived experience with colonial violence and erasure. So yeah, I don't think it's just specifically to the post-Soviet.
Yeah, and there is another question related to memory. It comes from Agalim Tolonmieva. She asked whether memory can be collective without transnational solidarity. For example, comfort women are shared transnational memory in Asia and found solidarity with Holocaust survivors. But what if there is no similar? But what if there is no similar trauma? Can we say that memory is constrained by current socioeconomic changes? So, like, I guess the question is largely about like how memory can reflect on the questions that we discussed, post-colonial, post-Soviet, and how we have to address it in our scholarly works and engaging with public audiences, and how we can contribute to understanding these memories by working on this area. Yeah, please go ahead.
I was thinking about the role of the museums in the memory process. For instance, in Mexico, we have a lot of museums. For example, the Museo Memoria y Tolerancia, Memory and Tolerance in Mexico is a very big museum, and inside the museum, you see the Shoah, the Jewish Holocaust. You see the Armenian Holocaust. You see the genocide in Kosovo, etc. So if I have to put money in one process right now in Latin America, I will put all my money to promote Ukraine and all the Eastern Europe in the museums. Is a very good way to deal with the two levels of Oksana in parallel, in the academic way, but also in the public sphere. So the issue is how to help to the European, Eastern Europe, etc., to performance themselves in Latin America, to show themselves. So I am thinking about memory and museum. In Chile, we have a very good museums, but we don't have any information about the Eastern Europe, only about the Holocaust, the Jewish Holocaust. You see some issues about the Eastern Europe. So it's a very good question about memory. And I was thinking about museums to show them inside some exposition about the Holodomor. In 2 days is the Holodomor commemoration, if I am right, no? So far, I don't know any any country in Latin America to deal with Holodomor inside the museum system. So it's a good opportunity to deal with.
Wonderful. I think we have very stimulating discussion, and we have go through all of the questions in the chat. And if people in the audience, I would like to provide opportunity to raise question in person, want to raise question and unmute yourself and present yourself, you are very welcome. It's, I guess, last opportunity in this session. So I will give some time to people. Yeah, I guess we have already been for 2 hours, and it's been already very, very stimulating discussion. And thank you so much, everyone. And just I will give a floor to Amitav for brief concluding thoughts, and then we will round up.
Thank you, Irina. And as I said at the beginning, this is not my field, but the questions and themes and debates that came up, I think about every day, and I was thinking about them while this symposium was going on. I work on British imperial history. A few things came to my mind that I thought I will convey. A few things that we must reject when it comes to the whole project of decolonizing academia. There is this impulse that the job of decolonizing academia should take us back to how things were before colonialism. The impulse of that kind of a pride on how we used to be before our way of life and systems of thinking were sort of violently destroyed by the colonial presence. The thought there is that it is not possible to go back. Colonialism is a fundamentally irreversible transformative process, and we just can't really try to go back, but rather come to terms with how changes have occurred over time and what and the nature of the transformation that one needs to analyze. And the second, the exact opposite of that impulse, is to reject it on the basis of triumphalist Eurocentric thought that doesn't really apply to me, or certain aspects of knowledge have to be approached from a West European lens, otherwise we don't know what it is. But there too, I think Kimberly has been talking about Fanon, but not only Fanon, but also Baldwin, the idea that the colonizer is also transformed. It is not the colonized who is transformed in the process. It is a reciprocal process. So the engagement with decolonizing academia is very much also central to those forces who have been the inheritors of the colonizing forces. So the last thing is then what is lost if we don't intellectually engage with the process of decolonizing academia? And here I'll speak from the very core of my discipline of history. And the thought there is that the way history as an academic discipline has been shaped in the 19th century, and hence the tools of historiography often leave out structures and processes and historical events in the past that historiography is simply not equipped to answer. And there are historical processes and reflections in the past that therefore exceeds historiography as we know it. So the late historian Ranajit Guha talks about this as historicality, the entire universe of possibilities that are of interest to us as historians. Historicality exceeds historiography. And in terms of bridging that gap, decolonizing academia and history and historiography is central to a better academic project in the future. That's what I wanted to share, but also sort of taking away from this symposium. And I want to thank folks in the REIS, and especially Irina, for inviting me to be a guest moderator. I now turn it back to you.
Thank you so much. So I think we're just right in time to give some very quick feedback or thoughts from our speakers. And then we will finish the recording, and I will thank you all for being instrumental for this symposium. You could go in order, like I think maybe Sven could start and then Kimberly.
It's just an open process. So then thanks so much for this very interesting conversation. I started thinking about one of the comments: can memory be collective without transnational solidarity? I think we need memory, and especially memory studies when it comes to post-colonial studies and post-coloniality to trigger empathy and make transnational solidarity possible through knowledge transfers. This is just something that comes to my mind, and somebody else in the chat is going into the same direction. The other thing I wanted to mention is because there were some questions in the chat of how to implement it. I mean, the things I am doing, and I talked about it, is of course my teaching. So this is where I have an audience and can implement specific projects. And what was helpful for me is the simple strategy to localize the global and globalize the local in pretty much simple exhibition projects and so on. And this is kind of where it works. And this is, I think, where you have a very fruitful debate with a younger generation, with students that are maybe the next generations that end up in specific institutions and administrations. And maybe this could have an impact, or at least I hope this might have an impact. So this is my last takeaway, and I hand it over to, I don't know whom.
Was I next? Okay, so just I want to thank everyone for such an amazing and fruitful conversation. I have tons of notes that I will definitely be putting in my dissertation as I'm writing it. I think that what I hope most people take away from our conversation is decolonization. I love the idea of decolonizing. It's an act, it's a process, it's ongoing, but also to how widespread this process is, and that we need to have a reciprocal understanding of these processes, the way that they're happening, but also the differences in context and the way that these things play out. And I would hope that it leads to more open conversations, dialogues, and cooperation between Ukraine, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, the Global South, and marginalized communities in the West.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead, Diana.
Oh, sorry. I thought I was not muted. I'm sorry. The question is kind of like to make a conclusion to things, or? Sorry,
yes, we are going in the round of conclusions just before the end of our session. So
yeah, I think. Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank everybody for the fruitful discussion, and for, I think it's the whole point of sort of having the interdisciplinary discussion and hearing from different positions and different methodologies, even though some of the hardcore decolonial scholars don't believe in methodology, and but then nevertheless on different angles of views and so on. And I think it is true that academia flourishes in this understanding of non-linear, non-universal, but actually pluriversal ideas, and we should be disagreeing, and we should be having debates in order to create better scholarship and better ideas. But also, on the other hand, we should also be very attentive to the communities that produce that knowledge as well. And I just wanted to come back to one of the comments in the chats that spoke about the kind of like the creative field. That where the decolonial really emerges. And I think it's completely true. Looking at some of the artworks, they translate much better than any of the texts we could have written, or any of the sort of the dialogues that artists, writers, musicians have among themselves at the same moment while we're discussing it here. I think for them, these kind of imperial terms of Eastern Europe or post-Soviet or any other sort of peripheral understandings, don't really work out in the same way, or maybe sometimes they're not even bothered by these ideas and concepts. And I think, yeah, especially in the work of art in general and creative work, it's just beautiful how they translate the experiences and how they translate the emotions of the everyday and living under these conditions into what they do. And I'm really, really glad. And I just want to mention that there are a lot of great initiatives in both languages, in English and in Russian, and sort of local languages as well. There are podcasts on YouTube. I should take the moment to kind of like make a reclam. I'm sorry about that. But there's a podcast called Decolon. It's about decoloniality in Central Asia and peoples of Russia. So Buryat, Kalmyk, Tuvan, and other people are participating in that debate, Kyrgyz as well, and hopefully it will enlarge more into Sakha and other voices, Uzbek voices as well. So there's that, and it's both bilingual. It's mostly in Russian now, but it will be in English as well. I think I should mention Elmira Kakabayeva's decolonial writing course for Central Asian and mostly female scholars, and the type of work that comes out of that collective is incredibly, you know, it's been a big window for me just to see how people can write reflectively of sort of decolonial experiences in self-reflexive style of essays. And I think that's the type of genre that should be seeing more instead of just this sort of like, you know, handbooks and academic discussions. I think it's really, really valuable to see these voices and to see this type of text and expressions. And of course, just looking into what artists bring and following some of the artists would be also incredibly useful. So I just wanted to highlight those initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana. Can we move now to Oksana and then Manuel and Kimberly? Like, or like in any order, if you are ready, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, I just want to thank you, and I really learned a lot, and I was listening to all these conversations and that you mentioned, and I think that this exchange of ideas, the support with colleagues, especially from colleagues from different regions and from different areas of study, is so crucial. So I do believe that collegiality matters, and it's very important in this decolonizing process. Yeah, thank you.
Now, can you join?
I only want to say thank you, Irina. Thank you, Amitava. Nice to hear Kimberly, Oksana, Sven, Diana. Thank you very much. My email is open to any proposal to make any ideas, because in Latin America we don't have anything, so we can do a lot of things. So thank you very much, my friends.
Wonderful. Thank you, Manuel. You will have like dozens of emails be ready to answer. So Sven, can you follow up?
I already did.
Ah, I'm sorry. I'm already, it seems I'm already tired. No worries. So who have not responded or would like to respond, like it takes the floor. And I think, yeah, I think everyone have responded. I'm sorry. So the last words, thank you again so much for all of the efforts to prepare for this very important and very timely conversation. And thank you for everything that you already been doing for developing these discussions. And already learned a lot and got lots of knowledge from all of you and the events you organized and the articles you read, and other colleagues who are not here have worked and published articles for all of us. And it's really stimulating, as Oksana mentioned, to be a part of this community and work collegially with all of you and expand the borders of our collaborations and work as a community. And it's really helpful to be as a community in such very difficult and important and challenging times for many countries and our region and Ukraine in particular. And I just also would like to briefly say that this video will be available at RIS YouTube channel. So if you or your colleagues would like to watch it later, it will be available in the coming next days. And yes, I hope that we'll stay in touch, and look forward also to answering your emails, and as Manuel suggested, and working closely with many of you later. Thank you all a lot, and take care.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone. This was wonderful.